So good evening. Welcome to UX and Data. So tonight we have Brian Foo, and I'm super excited because I heard a version of this talk and it was really awesome. Brian is a data visualization artist at the American Museum of Natural History, where he designs interactive exhibits using scientific data and research. He most recently designed a permanent exhibit about climate change in the museum's Hall of Planet Earth using open data. His personal work uses data to create music, objects, and physical spaces, and has been featured in Information is Beautiful, NPR, and the Museum of Art and Design. Please welcome Brian.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for coming tonight. Basically today I'll be talking about the process and challenges of creating music through data. But I guess before I do that, I'm gonna kind of talk about a bit of my background and how I got there, and then after I talk through this project, I'll kind of talk about what I've been doing recently. One feature of my work is that it's all on the web, and that's kind of part of how I work. I try to make everything public, and all the things that you see in here, you could just go to my website and look at it. All my projects I try to have them pretty well documented. And if there is anything that is created by code, all the code is usually open source. So that's one aspect of that. So a bit of my background. My background is in a combination of computer science and visual arts. So I have been coding for a couple decades. And for most of my life, including through college and after college, those two worlds are mostly separate. So I mostly made money through building websites and programming. The art that I did was mostly visual arts, and was like painting and drawing and printmaking and things like that. So those worlds were mostly separate for most of my life. It wasn't until about 7 years ago I started working at the New York Public Library. There's kind of where I started to think about those two things together. And kind of the glue that kind of binding them together is this idea of like digital humanities or information or data or education. This idea of kind of using data sets or materials and exploring them in interesting ways using computer science, algorithms, machine learning, things like that. So I actually, while working at the New York Public Library, I worked in a group called Labs, New York Public Library Labs, that unfortunately no longer exists. So we were kind of a small group of developers and designers, and we were tasked to think about how can the library accomplish its mission in kind of the digital age, where people are less likely to go to the library to create, to research and things like that, and thinking about how the mission, which is still relevant, kind of increasing access to information, to materials, encourage creation, learning, all that stuff. How can the library do that in the digital age? So a lot of our work was around just basic stuff like digitizing things and putting them on the web. When I actually started working at the library, one of the first things I had to do was to innovate on the way that people view video at one of the research libraries. And innovation is basically, from the library's point of view, what you had to do previously was you go to the library, you request a particular video, and you're on these like little kiosks or something, and you type in your thing, you search, you press play, and what actually happens is that when you press play, somebody downstairs takes the tape and puts it in a player and presses play and waits for you to press stop, and then they press stop. So it's like this weird delay, but it's actually an actual person controlling the video. So that's kind of the level of innovation we were getting at. So it was. So a lot of it was kind of infrastructure for creating this workflow of how to get a lot of the hundreds of thousands or millions of things that the library has, get it digitized, so everything from books to video to music, getting it digitized, getting on the web, getting it searchable, getting it discoverable. So that was a big part of our work. The part that I was very interested was, what happens after digitization? What happens when you put all these things online? Because there's a lot of things, especially like maps or manuscripts or books, they aren't really that usable as images. You could just put a whole book or telephone book on the web, and it's not searchable. So what we did is that we combined things like computer vision, machine learning, as well as crowdsourcing to extract structured data out of our materials. So that was a big part of our work, and then making that data also available as a resource, and then doing interesting things with that data to show that that data is useful and that it's there, and to obviously highlight some of the collections that we have and kind of increase use of those things. So this is one of the first projects that I did around that. So a few years ago, we released about 200,000 images into the public domain, which was a lot of work from a technical point of view, but that was also a lot of work from a legal point of view. We had to do a lot of work with the librarians to do a lot of due diligence to declare these as public domain materials. So what I wanted to do was, think of ways to just visualize, just to show, what this means. What does 200,000 images mean? And this is kind of this mosaic. Right now, it's organized by date created, so you could see all these old stereographs. I think these are menus. There's like maps, and then you could kind of show it by genre. Again, stereographs, a lot of menus, maps, by collection, by color. So this was kind of my first data visualizations, as one might refer to it. And this is kind of where I started to think more critically about how I could kind of combine my visual art background and my computer science background. Part of this public domain release, it included this collection called the Green Book Collection. You might have heard of the movie that was released last year, I guess. So for those of you not familiar, the Green Book was this travel guide that was published between the 30s and 60s. That essentially was this book that told you, if you were a black traveler, where it was safe to stay, what gas stations were safe to stop at, restaurants, all these things. And these were completely above ground, publications because, at the time, the Jim Crow era, it was legal to discriminate against people. So the New York Public Library actually has the largest collection in the nation, in the world, because they actually started to collect these travel guides as they're being published. So this was part of the public domain release, and we published them online. You could actually browse through all these books. But again, when you kind of go through these books, they're all text. It's basically a directory of businesses. And it's really not that useful as images. So what we did is that we extracted the text out of these images, and then we tried to use a mixture of crowdsourcing and some of our data sets to extract the actual place where all these businesses were, which is a little bit difficult because a lot of these addresses no longer exist. But we created visualizations that kind of show this in any particular year, the coverage of that particular book. And this starts to allow you to, start to ask questions. You might not make any conclusions from this, but it's just interesting to see, what areas had more businesses, what areas had less businesses, why are there gaps in certain areas. And then I started to think of interesting ways to to create experiences around this rich data set. So I created this interface that allowed you to, create a start address. Let's go Orlando. And so you enter start and end address, and then it tries to map a trip for you. Did I spell that right? It tries to map a trip for you based on this algorithm where you have to stay at a hotel every so often, you had to eat every so often, and it creates these very inefficient routes. In this case, where you're going from Florida to California, you have to go around Texas, or so it kind of makes it kind of makes you think about this underlying material. And it makes you think about the data in a different way, in a very human way, an empathetic way. Thinking about how it might be different, to travel at a different time with a different color skin. This is also where I started to think about data visualization or kind of experiences around data as something very human, and using language that you're familiar with, like maps. Trip planners, things like that, in ways that when you combine it with different underlying data sets, it creates for interesting experiences. So that's where I kind of got into this music project that I said I would talk about. So this was a personal project. So this was around the same time where I was working at the library. Kind of the original motivation of this project was to really just learn how to make music, because I have no music background. And in order for me to actually make music, I tried to combine some existing skill sets. So my familiarity with computer algorithms, data science, things like that, and combine those in a way that can make music in a hopefully aesthetically pleasing way. So I started with this first data set. So this song is called The Two Trains. I'll just start playing it. So this song, it takes you through a ride on the 2 train along the New York City subway. And it starts in Brooklyn and it goes through to the Bronx. And the music that you hear at any given moment correlates to the median household income of the neighborhood that you're passing through. So the start of this song, as you're kind of further into Brooklyn, it's relatively quiet, not that many instruments playing. As you get closer to like Brooklyn Heights, you'll hear the data, the contrast of the data. And as we get closer to the bridge, it'll get louder. So if you could kind of, if you kind of imagine kind of the graph of income inequality over the 2 train, it will peak around now. Just Wall Street. So here we're talking about, over $250,000 median household income. And it slowly gets quieter as you get uptown. I'm going to skip ahead to the Bronx. So the difference between the Wall Street and like just 5 miles up, into the East Bronx, is somewhere between like 750,000 to somewhere around like between 10 and 15,000. Like that's like the difference. And what I wanted to do was somehow translate that contrast into the contrast of the song. So kind of the song that you hear, the shape of it, the shape of the song, correlates to the contrast, or income inequality, that's represented in the data. A little about the process of making this song. It was very difficult. The main creative act here is thinking about how to map, a specific data point to a sound or to audio. And you could do that in so many ways, with data sonification or data music. You could do it through pitch, you could do it through volume, timbre, you could do it through rhythm, you could do it, all these things. When you're trying to convey something like income inequality, it can get very tricky from a kind of an ethical point of view, potentially. So for example, if I wanted to say map the wealthier areas to happier sounding songs or better quality songs or particular genres, that gets kind of troublesome, when you try to think about that. So, one thing I learned about this process through the song is that, with each data set, it might require a different way to map it into sound. And I kind of started with thinking about what should the listener feel, and that kind of makes you think about the power of music or the power of sound, or compared to, say, like a chart or a data visualization, is that it has a visceral, you have a visceral response to music, and you can't help but feel a certain way, when you hear a particular song. And that's very powerful as a creative person, as a musician. But it can present challenges for a data scientist, for somebody who's trying to convey information without too much bias, personal bias, even though everything is bias. So for this one, I wanted to really just focus on the contrast. So the algorithm here is that the wealthier the neighborhood, the more instruments can play, and then the louder they can play. Which the result is that if you kind of look at the just like the volume of the song over time, it will loosely correlate to the data, to the income inequality. And yeah, I didn't want to make any particular part of the song sound sadder or happier or use different instruments. The same rules applied to the whole song. And another feature of this song and all of the songs is that it's completely generated by the algorithm that I wrote. So no part of this song is manually edited. So basically, the first time I heard the song is when I pressed play. And the tricky thing from a creative point of view is that if I want to tweak one part of the song, like, you can't really do that. You can change the algorithm slightly, but that would change the entire song. So the result is I basically created like hundreds of versions of this song by tweaking like little parameters in the algorithm to make what you finally hear. Yeah, it's just this very interesting creative process where you don't really, especially because I don't have a music background, I couldn't really envision what the entire song would sound like if I changed something slightly. So yeah, it's basically this weird, creative process where you hear the thing that you created in its entirety when you press play. Let's see, is there anything else I wanted to say about this? So yeah, the other thing is that I try to match the sounds that I use with a particular data set that it represents. And you'll see that in some of the other songs that I have here. But everything that you hear also is sample-based music, so it's not synthesized. And I use that, because aesthetically I just think it's more interesting to kind of use sampled sounds. And that also allows me to be more to be more specific on what I sample, and have that also as a creative act, thinking about what genres I should pull from, what artists should I pull from, what sounds should I pull from. So this entire project is made up of 10 songs. I'll run through a few of them. But the general goal is that I try to think of this as a R&D project where there isn't really a lot of data music that exists. So I just really want to think about from a really broad, diverse point of view, what different data sets should sound like. So all these songs are made by very different data sets. And as you'll see, they require different solutions to make the right experience. So for this one, I'll also start to play it. So this one uses brainwave data, EEG data. And it uses data from an anonymous patient who has epilepsy. So brainwave data actually translates really well into sound because it uses a lot of terminology that you use in music or kind of sound design. So these are different nodes on the head. So each line here represents like different nodes, different brain activity along different parts of your brain. And the lines here, it has this idea of amplitude, which is kind of how big these waves are, the frequency, how close together different waves are, and there's another aspect of how synchronous things are across the brain. Typically speaking, under normal brain activity, your brain isn't always firing at once. Like different parts of your brain kind of randomly becomes active if you're talking, if you're listening to something. So typically, it's this constant rhythm with like some anomaly. But I translated these kind of terms, amplitude, frequency, and how synchronous things are across the brain into the song. So as you'll see, we'll get into the seizure event soon. So what happens during a seizure is that the different parts of your brain starts firing, so the amplitude increases. And it becomes more synchronous. So it's like kind of this pulsating thing. So I mapped this idea of synchronous activity to drum sounds. So you start to hear the drum sounds here. So the seizure event ends. And kind of what happens after that is the brain is very tired, but it has these random firings of high frequency events around the brain. So you hear kind of these string instruments playing like a high pitch sound. So again, the same thing with this song. It's entirely algorithm driven, so this isn't a manually created song. So I'll just pause it there. So yeah, some of the aesthetic decisions that I made. So as you've heard, I wanted to use a vocal sample because it did relate to kind of an individual human. And I want to use a particular song from Imogen Heap, which I don't know if you're familiar with this song. So she uses this like kind of weird synthetic, like half human, half like synthetic filter, but it's very like pure and yeah, I think it very well represented what I wanted. So what I did is that I kind of split it up into little samples. And I use that as different parts of the brain. And I wanted to I use this idea of, there's this term in, I don't know, like psychology or some kind of neuroscience or whatever, called like phantom words. When you kind of have these random syllables playing, you'll hear words. So in that way, I wanted to also engage the listener's brain into creating their own interpretation of the song, of the lyrics. And again, the experience I wanted the listener to have, and this is kind of was challenging as well, because I wanted to make music in general that is very pleasing and enjoyable to the listener. But in this case, because it is about this kind of seizure event, in order to communicate that properly, perhaps the listener should feel a little uncomfortable during that particular event. So yeah, that was kind of like the tricky balance that I needed to figure out was, how much should I try to make the listener uncomfortable, when the data is kind of showing that. So that was kind of one aspect of this that was very interesting. I did have some interesting feedback from this from people who actually did have epilepsy, and they did say that it did, the sound of the song was very familiar in the way in which the suddenness of the seizure event kind of comes on, and kind of what happens afterwards. And I actually some individuals gave me their data to generate a song for them, and I was able to do that because of this process, because I have the code that I just run the data through and it creates a completely different song. But it had the same kind of shape to it, which is interesting. So I'm going to skip ahead. So I did a couple of songs between these, but this one was also pretty popular at the time. So I made these a little while ago, but this became more relevant in the years since then. So this uses data from the United Nations of Refugee Movement over time. So this data set gives you, every single year, it has a list of countries, and then the amount of people that went from one country to another country because of war or political unrest or something. So it starts in the 70s and it goes through to 2012. I actually want to update this song with newer data because obviously that there's been a lot more movement since then as well. So if you can see, it might be a little difficult to see, but there's a map of the world here, and there's lines going from one country to another. The red part of the line is the country of origin, and the green part of the line is the country of asylum. So earlier in this data set, the movement isn't that far. You have some countries in like the Middle East, Africa, kind of moving within the continent. As we get into the 90s, you'll start to see more movement globally. So the algorithm here is that the distance that you move correlates to the duration and pitch of the string instrument that you hear. So the farther you go, kind of the deeper and longer the sound. And the number of instruments playing correlates to the number of countries involved in this movement, and the diversity of those instruments correlate to the diversity of countries involved. So you start to see over time, or you start to hear over time, kind of this very layered song that has a lot of different types of movement, and you get a lot more bass over time as well. So this is almost kind of a song about globalization, because as we get further along, you can see there's a lot more movement across the oceans, and obviously specific conflicts that might have happened. So a couple things about the aesthetic choices here. I decided to sample from kind of the genre of American country music. So the steel guitar is very prominent in the genre in this song. I think there's this very interesting phenomenon of American country music that, like, in other countries in like Asia and Africa, even ones that aren't English speaking, American country music is very popular. There's this hypothesis. There's this hypothesis that American country music has this kind of nostalgic quality to it. This longing for home, longing for the countryside or something. Both the lyrics and the sounds have that quality. And the steel guitar is kind of reminiscent of like the human crying voice or something. So I used a lot of those samples. And again, I kind of layered them, correlating to the distance that people travel, when they're going from one country to another because of conflict. So I'll move on. So this one, so we can turn down the volume a little bit. So here is the Louisiana coast over time. And this shows the red things that you see is the land loss over time. So this is the coastal regression that's happening in Louisiana for a number of reasons, including climate change. So what I'm doing is I'm playing this loop from a particular brass band from New Orleans. But as the land becomes lost, distorting, slowly kind of stretching the instruments to kind of get this quality of like instruments like underwater. So you'll see this kind of distortion happen over time. So this was like a very simple process of just looping this particular sample, but the amount it's stretched correlates to how much land is lost over time. So yeah, obviously aesthetic-wise, I wanted to use a sample from the local area, so using a brass band. And I wanted to have it reminiscent of, again, kind of using water as an analogy to slowly kind of submerge and stretch, the instruments playing. So I'll quickly jump to the next one. Not much time is left. So this one was, I think it had a similar problem to the brainwave one, where I typically try to make interesting sounding songs, but this particular data set didn't really give me something that would normally be considered interesting to a song. So this was problematic in a couple of ways. So one is that this is an example of a data set that's missing. So the goal of this song was to try to translate kind of the diversity of Hollywood into a song. So there isn't really a public data set to do this. So I kind of struggled with this for a while because I didn't want to I didn't want to make that data set because I think it's, you kind of have to do that carefully, especially since there's a lot of cases where, things can be ambiguous, especially with like gender and race. So that was one aspect of it. And then, because, well, I'll just start to play it and then I'll talk through it. So the idea here is that I kind of go through about a decade of blockbuster movies. I think the top 10 movies from each year for a decade. So the diversity of the instruments correlate to the diversity of the different movies. So we have white male, white female, male person of color, female person of color. So the piano that you hear is white male, which is a constant throughout the song. Female, you'll hear a female vocal. Person of color, you'll hear a guitar. So the result is kind of like a very boring song. And I could actually show you it. So I'm going to go to one of the last songs. So this song was, so this was kind of like the least depressing song. It seems like most of my songs are pretty depressing. So this one uses star data, and actually I'll show you an interactive version of this. So this was inspired by a piece by John Cage. He was an early avant-garde composer. And he composed a lot with like chants and kind of using existing materials to help him do that. So he used these star atlases to compose. So he created these, let's zoom in on this. So he had these star atlases, and then he kind of put musical staffs over the stars to generate these compositions. So I basically just directly, took that idea. So I'm going to drag. So you could drag to any part of the sky, and I'll just play that part of the sky. And this can create, an infinite amount of music. And there isn't really much to say about this. I guess it really just, just an interesting way of manifesting, this particular 3D data set. Very loosely speaking, the closer the star, the louder it plays. But obviously, you're translating a kind of a 3D data into a 2D musical staff. Turn that off. So yeah, that was the last piece in this particular series of music. And after that, I started to really think more about using other types of media as a way to experience data sets in interesting ways. And also this idea of using time, this time-based medium, which is another kind of aspect of music that both created a constraint, but also kind of drove creativity. So I created this piece called Light Reminders. So these are a representation of the lights in my apartment. And what I did is that I installed these smart light bulbs into different lights in my apartment. And I programmed it so whenever I see one of my friends, that their the light that's associated with them becomes brighter. So the idea is that if I don't see my friends after a period of time, my apartment becomes really dark, which wasn't great for my roommate. But you know, this is I didn't really think of this as a data project, but when I thought about it more, it is a data visualization. It just happens over a really long period of time, and it changes my space, it changes my physical space, and changes how I experience my space, and in my case, it also changed my relationships, you know, and this was just partly driven by the fact that, you know, as time went on, it was harder, or, you know, I saw my friends less and less for various reasons, but this was one way of, like, not like micromanaging it, but kind of just reminding me that they exist. And doing it in kind of a very thoughtful way that wasn't, you know, didn't seem cold, or, you know, a little more organic, I guess. I also worked on this coloring book. And this, I wanted to think of new ways people can interact with the data in an active, kind of this mixture of active and passive way, and also using the passage of time as a strength, you know, for this. So the idea here is that, you know, a lot of these are very basic visualizations that we see, but kind of we're asking the participant to actively fill in the data. So in this case, this is carbon emissions in the United States. And this creates this very slow data visualization that appears over time. And it kind of gives you the space to kind of think about what the data means, you know, think about particular areas, you know, of the country. It makes you sit with a data set for more than a couple minutes, which is what we usually do. We see a chart, we look at it, okay. But, you know, this makes you sit with a particular topic for 30 minutes, an hour. And it's physical, right? You can actually feel the data over time because your hand gets tired. I also try to use time, you know, as a way to convey different ideas. So this activity tells you to see how fast you could color in, I think it's 20 football fields in a minute, which is about how fast we're losing forests, net loss, 20 football fields per minute. And the idea is that you probably can't do that. You probably can't make it in a minute. So this uses, you know, this kind of idea of time to think about, you know, the underlying issue here. So again, this is kind of just, you know, just a series of activities that just use the act of coloring as a way to convey different ideas through data. I also had a couple personal projects using porcelain dinnerware as a medium. So this was me trying to learn more about my own kind of family history as well as Chinese American history. So my family came here in the early 1900s. And this is around the Chinese Exclusion Act that basically made it illegal for new immigrants to come from China. And this happened between the late 1800s all the way through to the 1940s. And this is kind of a graph of Chinese immigrants, new immigrants, over time. And I kind of plotted this data, and I looked at it, and it kind of looks like a soup spoon. So this is a profile of a soup spoon that show this data over time. So you kind of see before the Chinese Exclusion Act, it was a certain number, and then throughout over time, you know, there's a drop, and then around the Second World War, when China allied with the United States, they lifted the ban. And then there was another Immigration and Nationality Act that happened in 1965, which increased that further. So I wanted a way to kind of embed, my history, my family history, into pieces that that are kind of embedded in daily life and something I could kind of pass down, and kind of the dinner table is a place to kind of talk about family or talk about history and things like that. And I did a few more pieces that had to do with other different aspects of Chinese American history. But yeah, some of these are data-driven, some of them are not. So I'll quickly get to where I'm working now. So this happened around the time when I was designing the climate change coloring book. I saw that the American Museum of Natural History was looking for a data visualization artist to design an exhibit about climate change, which was like kind of a very strangely relevant fit for me. So here I work in a group called the Science Visualization Group, and we kind of use new media and new technology and different visualization techniques to communicate current science in the permanent halls of the museum. So we try to look for areas areas of science that are more likely to change, or our understanding of it to change, as well as sciences that are mostly driven by data. In this case, astrophysics, climate science. When you think about the Museum of Natural History, there's a lot of specimens on display, but there's certain things that there isn't really a physical representation of a particular idea. There are things like tree rings and ice cores, but when you think about climate change, it happens over a really long period of time and it happens globally. So how scientists study this is through global data. So I created a number of visualizations that are updated as we get new data. So there's kind of a living exhibit. And there are areas where you can kind of play with that data. So this is kind of one of the interactive pieces. So this is a basic graph of global temperature anomaly over time. You see it's increasing over about 150 years. The idea is that you can kind of zoom in and out to a particular year or out through the whole 150-year record. So I added this idea of sliding through and like listening to a particular year. So a particular year, you don't really hear anything. It's kind of this like random noise. But as you kind of zoom out and hear more of that data, you hear a clear trend. So the lesson being, this idea of weather versus climate, or you kind of need to see, you need enough data in order to make particular conclusions. And I tried to use, again, kind of sound, and this is kind of where I injected the sonification work that I did in the permanent halls. So it's kind of an ongoing, experience, with data visualization or data sonification. That kind of concludes that. So one last thing is that, again, everything that I do, all the things that you saw today, you could access it on my website. And in the documentation, there's links to the code that generates every single piece, both the visual and the sounds. So you can either recreate it, you could adapt it. It's all open source, and it's all generated using open source technologies. That's kind of that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. I had a question. So if I look at those individual visualizations with music, how long did it take you to come up with like one of these pieces?
Yeah, so each song took between a month and a few months. And I was working on these part-time, like I had a full-time job, so this was like a personal project. But yeah, there's kind of 3 phases of work. So one is just research, just like looking for the right data set, looking for the right topic, and seeing what's out there. And also investigating the data set, so trying to see if the data set is interesting or it has, can be readily translated into a song. So there's a lot of data sets that I thought were very interesting, but it didn't really make for an interesting song because of either the shape of it or the topic. Yeah, so that was kind of the first phase, and that can take an unknown amount of time. Then there's the actual kind of production process, which again, there isn't really one way of doing it because each song, I basically invented a completely new song. So I couldn't rely on one particular process. So it was trying to think of the right algorithm, the right composition, the right sounds, all that stuff. And that I could go through literally like hundreds of iterations of a particular song. And that could take, like any period of time, but usually like a few months. And then the last period, I try to document everything as much as I could. So yeah, that's basically. And this entire project took about a year and a half, a couple years. Yeah.
Thanks for the very inspiring presentation. So I'm interested in sort of how you approach a new data set, and so and I have an interesting music data set, and I'm kind of curious, like how you would approach, like for example, deciding on the length of samples or the map that you're using, or so in a nutshell, Gary and I have launched a live music discovery app where people vote on shows that they hear clips of. So what this does is it generates a very interesting data set on hundreds, 200-300 of shows that are happening in various areas in New York City, and sort of some shows that are very much liked and some that are not liked. And it's sort of, I could imagine sort of traveling like your train and hearing the sounds of various neighborhoods and getting a sense of what these scenes, music scenes, sound like. But one of the things I noticed is that sometimes you use samples that are extremely short and that come from probably various songs. And I wonder if you make these samples longer, if it starts sounding bad, or how do you approach kind of the mixing these samples, which I find sound really nice?
Yeah, specifically kind of the sample-based process has a lot of different aspects to it. So, kind of going back a little bit, I typically think about the end experience first. So that kind of gives me the sense of like generally like what the listener should be feeling, which might reference a particular genre, might reference a particular musical scale, might reference a particular sound, typically the shorter the sample, it typically works better when you're mixing a bunch of different samples together from very different sources. The longer the sample, the more kind of overlap that you have, that could just get very complex. And it's just more of the fact that I don't have a music background, is that it's hard for me to envision how certain things interact with each other. So typically I try to think of things in like individual notes, and then particular samples associated with that. So I've typically found that shorter the better, but I think it just depends. I don't know if that's helpful. Cool.
Hi, thank you for the great presentation. You said you've been doing this 20 years, which is amazing, but what kind of project would you recommend for someone doing this, say, 1 year?
Right. Well, I would say to that is that I've been like programming and stuff for 20 years, but this stuff specifically, I pretty much learn everything as I make a new project. So each of these projects, like I pretty much start from scratch. Obviously, I still have a lot of prior knowledge in terms of programming. But are you asking like specific like frameworks to use, libraries, technologies? I mean, the way I approach things in general, and this might not be for everybody, but I just learn just enough that I need to make the thing that I want to make, and that's kind of like a brute force way of doing it. But yeah, I feel it's like overwhelming to kind of learn like generally something, you know, like learning 3D modeling or learning programming generally before I make something. Like I just have an idea, I have an end thing that I want to make, and then I just learn the minimum that I need, which is basically Googling stuff and copying, pasting a lot of stuff. And then you kind of learn over time, you get kind of pieces from different areas, and you know, it's basically learning by creating. I mean, that's kind of, you know, it's probably not very helpful, but that's just my process, and I kind of embrace that. I kind of embrace the idea that I don't know a lot of things, and I don't plan to learn. I don't plan to become an expert in anything, and also I think the fact that the when you're in this state of not knowing how to do something, I think that's when you could kind of create very interesting solutions that even somebody who's been doing this for 20 years can never think of, because they don't have that mindset of like, I don't know how to make this. I'm just going to make this in some weird way, this combination of ways that, you know, I combine some previous experience, you know, and that's kind of how I made this music. I didn't use any existing software. I kind of just invented my own tools to do it. And that's only because I had those existing things to begin with. I knew how to code, I knew how to work with data, but I didn't know Ableton, or I didn't know all these other software. I didn't know how to use those things, so I just didn't use those. So hopefully it created for an interesting new aesthetic experience. But yeah, that's how I think about it.
Yeah, thanks for this great talk. You mentioned that you took a lot of this up to teach yourself concepts of music, and you also mentioned the creative space created by not knowing how to do something. I'm just wondering if you could comment on, as you've done more and more projects and presumably learned more and more about music, does that feed back into the work you're doing, or do you like consciously search for something you haven't tried before?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of built into the structure of this project that, like I said from the beginning, each song would require a different solution, or I try to seek a data set that would require a different solution. So I try to have a very diverse set of data sets to, again, kind of force me to almost start from scratch, kind of. But I did accrue some knowledge. Obviously, you can't help but do that. But I typically do, and this is just like a personal bias, but I typically do try to just do something new with every new project, and that's even identifying just a completely different medium to work with. But you'll find that, you know, existing knowledge and existing experiences will creep its way into it, even subconsciously, which I think is interesting. You know, I think it's just a matter of just trying to do a bunch of different things, and when those other non-related things, when those things creep into what you're doing, I think that's when things become very interesting. So yeah, I try not to get too complacent in a particular way of doing things, but you know, you kind of have to balance that with just being efficient. And you know, if something did work, you know, maybe use some of that, but you know, maybe change it slightly. And there's really no specific process to it. You know, I try to just kind of choose the right process for the particular thing that I'm doing, and I just have to remind myself, like, to not use a particular skill just because I have it, you know, or just because I learned something recently to use it. That's always very difficult to do.
Thanks, Brian. This was great. My question is, what was your most exciting project that you worked on? And then what was the most challenging? And it could be the same one, but maybe.
Exciting. Well, I think the climate change exhibit that I worked on at the museum was very exciting because it was something I didn't do before in the sense of designing for the general public. And not only that is that I can actually go there and look at people interacting with it, which is not something I can typically do with my projects that are mostly online. I know that people listen to things, I know that people look at things, but I never really actually see them react to it. And I think that's what's exciting about working at the museum is that whenever I'm like working on something or testing something out, I can actually go and look and see people's reactions, like completely candid. And that's very exciting to me. Challenging, I mean, all of the things are challenging. I could probably say that one's probably the most challenging, but it seems like a cop-out. Yeah, I would say between the exhibit and the data-driven DJ project as a whole was definitely I mean, I think anything that kind of gets you out of your comfort zone is always challenging, but in a good way. As I mentioned in some of these pieces, were very challenging for a number of reasons, but yeah, I would say, but yeah, I feel all projects should be challenging. I think because I think, and that's kind of related to the other question is that if you're not really pushing yourself, then you're probably not you're probably not thinking innovatively or out of the box or something. So I try to have the right amount of challenge for each project.
One of the things I appreciated in your talk is that you can, I think, we're all awash in data in our professional lives and in our personal lives, and you're experimenting with the aesthetics and the feeling of data in a way that I've not contemplated before. And so it was just very exciting to hear about that, and I wanted to appreciate that. And also ask how explicit is that a feature of your work? Are you trying to get people to feel the data and enter into their consciousness in a different way?
Yeah, I think especially with the music project, that was explicit, and I think that's only because music is just very special in that way, that I can't help but make a visceral reaction. I just had to make sure it's the right one. Because I could produce some random song and it would make somebody feel a certain way, but it might not be the right thing. So I had to really think critically about that. And yeah, it does have this other interesting feature of, when you think of a chart or data visualization, it doesn't really have that visceral reaction, and it also doesn't get stuck in your head in the same way that music does. And I think that's a strength of music as well, is that you can get a melody stuck in somebody's head, but if you could kind of attach an idea to that, I think that's very powerful and potentially dangerous. I don't know, but yeah, that was definitely an explicit thing from the beginning, and that was because I identified that music in particular has that power. So I had to kind of think of that in a critical way.
Thank you very much, Brian. Let's give Brian another round of applause. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and if you enjoyed tonight, I hope you'll share with a friend about UX and data, and we'll see you next month. Have a good night.